This video is brought to you by Dashlane. Well, hello friends. We're doing another video on a country that has veered into some real yikes territory over the years. So yes, I have amazing patrons who have helped me achieve many financial goals to get to the point where now I am a fully independent YouTuber. And one of those stretch goals was to make a 4-part series in my brief history series where I kind of profile a country on the BRICS countries, which stand for Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And when I originally made it, I thought it was just Brazil, Russia, India, and China because, you know, I decided to write it down before looking things up because I'm smart in that way. So when someone quickly reminded me that BRICS includes South Africa, I knew that this was going to be a fun video project to work on. South Africa is kind of a tough country with a whole history of apartheid, white supremacy, and settler colonialism, which is pretty similar to my country of Canada with white supremacy and settler colonialism. Just, you know, we somehow have better branding. No, what I should really say is that South Africa, at a certain point in its history, made white supremacy and settler colonialism like an art form, and we'll get into that. So the BRICS in general are an actual organization. They're made up of 5 of the world's, quote, emerging economies. They are expected to become the superpowers of the 22nd century and beyond. Now, I've already done a video on the history of Brazil, which you should definitely watch. But honestly, when it comes to look at the list, you got Brazil, okay. You've got Russia, okay. India, yeah. China, yeah. And then South Africa kind of sticks out. It doesn't really feel like it's emerging economy that's setting itself up to become one of the, you know, world superpowers. If anything, if there was a country in Africa, if they really wanted to have African representation, you'd probably want to choose Nigeria. It's got a population explosion on the horizon. It has oil reserves and is quickly growing into one of the most powerful countries in the entire continent. But South Africa does have a lot going for it. It sits on a giant natural resource supply, specifically in gold and diamonds and platinum, which you can probably imagine makes South Africa a pretty good place for foreign investment, where if you're thinking about everything in terms of global capitalism, makes South Africa a juicy place to invest in. South Africa is seen as this place where you can invest in the entire continent because South Africa has the best infrastructure or something like that. I don't know. I don't get to choose who's the member of the BRICS, okay? I was going to do it last in the series as I kind of cover them through the fall, so expect that through the fall. But then Project Africa came to my attention, which is that myself and 25 other history YouTubers are producing content, all coming out today, if you're watching this on the day it came out, and we're all talking about subjects to do with the African continent. So it fit perfectly for me. And there's a lot of reasons why South Africa is interesting to talk about. It's one of the oldest regions humans have lived in, and even things before humans. But on top of that, I am Canadian and I live in a settler colony. Canada recently had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was based on South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So there's a lot of eerie parallels between this country and my own. So I would like to investigate the feeling of settler colonialism, and also as a settler colonist myself, as a white person on indigenous territory, I have a lot of complex feelings. So, without further ado, let's talk about South Africa. So South Africa has had anatomically modern humans living there for over 100,000 years. If you want to count non-human hominids like Australopithecines and things like that, there have been people living in South Africa for millions of years. At one point, it was considered one of the highest populated areas of the world when humans only lived in a few regions. So this means we have evidence of cultures, movements, politics, things happening that are older than the first human going to Europe. This is like one of the cool things for me about studying South Africa and a lot of Africa in general, which is that the history is so deep. Like we talk about India and China as having 5,000-year histories, and South Africa has a 130,000-year history, which is an amount of time humans are incapable of understanding. It also speaks to one of those things that always comes up when I'm having a more pensive moment about how humanity and what we know about what we call history is really just the tiniest sliver at the end of human culture. Just thinking about how much of human existence we know very little about, and also just appreciating shit's old. So an ethnic group that live in South Africa known as the Sandpeople, which is sort of a derogatory term that was given to them for being hunter-gatherers, they're likely the descendants of the first anatomically modern humans to arrive in South Africa. Because they're also related to the Khoi people, oftentimes the generic name for the people in this ancient time period are known as the Khoisan people. Just wanted to mention, when we're talking about 130,000 years ago, the first human migration to Eurasia, so Europe or Asia, was about 70,000 years ago. So there were humans living in South Africa for 60,000 years, and that was before the first migrations into Europe and Asia. So how do we even know this is true? Like, how do archaeologists figure this out? And I was really interested. So it comes down to two factors, which is one, genetics. There's a large amounts of studies of the genetics of African people. They have more genetic diversity than any other group, which is a sign that they have been living in this region for a lot longer than other groups. Humans in general actually have remarkably low genetic diversity, where actually the average human is much more similar to the other average human than, say, two cats or two dogs or two of most other species, which there's theories about that, including the Toba catastrophe theory, but that's a different video. And most of the genetic diversity of humanity, the little that there is almost entirely contained within the African continent, which is one of the big signs that this is where we evolved, this is where we originated. And, you know, coding back the genetic lineage, we do find that the first ancestors of the indigenous people of South Africa probably did arrive in South Africa around 130,000 years ago. Another thing that we'd like to look at, and this comes up in the study of indigenous Americans too, which is linguistic diversity, or the traits, different like sounds and different grammar rules and things like that move and have a lineage of their own, so you can almost trace a family tree of language. And also, you can tell that people have been in a region for a long time when there is a lot of diversity of language. This is why in Canada, or in North America in general, the most diverse and complex language groups tend to live in British Columbia, because that's about where humans first came to the continent via the Bering Land Bridge. So that's really cool. I think that these are really interesting ways to trace the lineage of people and find movements that just kind of belie archaeology, because it's just so old that there's such scant remains, like physical remains of the people who lived in this time, that every time it's found, it's like a huge historical event. There's only a few caves where we have found evidence of people living in South Africa that is dated back this far, and each one of them has been labeled as a World Heritage Site, which means, like, you know, it's a big deal. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, the ancestors, the Khoisan people, they lived in South Africa, and when they were a long time ago, this was probably one of the most populous regions for humanity in general, to the point where, like, this was a major evolution center for humans learning how to do human things. And some of those amazing discoveries, we've found paintings, we found so much artwork that is so old we can scarcely conceive of it. Just an absolute treasure for the species. Now, the people who lived in this region were primarily hunter-gatherers, you know, foraging off of the land and occasionally killing wild game to feed themselves. But about 2,000 years ago, the Khoi people entered the region, and with them, they brought some new technologies, I guess, for lack of a better word, on how to get food, specifically herding, which is a huge deal in South Africa, because South Africa has a lot of plains. And so there was a big influx of, you know, herding large herds of animals to eat, to get milk, to get skins, to get fur, you know, all those things that you need. And it had huge social ramifications. The introduction of herding basically changed a lot of how culture works and how people got their calories and all sorts of things. It became the predominant way of producing food. And because historical materialism is a thing, the introduction of this pastoral lifestyle as opposed to foraging started the development of more hierarchical societies. This is when you started to have societies gathered around clans, which were run by, chieftains and things like that. It's also the beginning of the concept of private property and the concept of wealth as a thing. Then in the 6th century, the Bantu people started to launch this mass migration across the continent. It touched virtually the entire continent, but when it came to South Africa, it was extremely profound. They came in through the Congo Basin. And when they came in, they displaced people and stuff moved around. But they also introduced a bunch of new technologies. Again, they brought agriculture. They were growing sorghum and millet there. They also brought with them ironworking. And so some of the most interesting and cool weapons in the world are developed by Bantu people in South Africa. It's really, really awesome. And the Bantu people also brought with them the first kingdom, which was called the Kingdom of Mapungubwe. I apologize in advance. That was probably a horrible pronunciation. But this kingdom was the forerunner for the Kingdom of Zimbabwe, which will be a dead country, don't you worry. And then, as what happens with any cool story, Europeans arrive and everything goes to shit. So the first Europeans to discover what would be today's South Africa was a Portuguese sailor by the name of Bartholomew Dias, who arrived in the country in 1488. Is that right? 1488? That's an unfortunate number. He was looking for an alternate route to get to India, to reconnect with the spice trade and various luxury good trades there, because the Ottoman Empire was on the grow, and the Ottoman Empire had basically taken control of what would be called the Silk Road, which is a pathway through Asia. So, they were looking a way to sail all the way down around Africa and come back up. They did not really appreciate how big it was, but they eventually did it. I also made a video about the whole Ottoman Empire thing, so you can watch that. It's really old, though. Then a little bit later, in 1497, Vasco da Gama crossed the Cape of Good Hope and is the person who actually found the full route up to India and made the trade link, which was a really big deal for South Africa because before the 20th century, going down around the continent and back up was really the fastest way to sail to India. And South Africa is an important port of call during that process. And so trade started to open up, and the Dutch became the first people to make a permanent European settlement in South Africa. Specifically, the mega corporation known as the Dutch East India Company, which wanted to make a permanent place in the region so that they could resupply their ships with, fruits and vegetables and all the things you need to, feed sailors. And then they could, load up and go up to India. Very small, very strategic, just, little thing. They built their first settlement and they started to build farms, but the indigenous people there, the Khoi people who were living in the region where they settled, did not want to have anything to do with them. So they started to import farmers from Europe to start, growing crops. They could have those vegetables to give to those ships as they were moving along. And also they imported slaves from places like Indonesia, India, Madagascar, Mauritius, places that the Dutch had some sort of holding in. And eventually also Khoi and Sandpeople were drafted as indentured servants, which is not technically slavery, but pretty damn close. So with all of these different cultures and backgrounds and stuff living in this place, you had, various languages meshing together. Some of the people who they brought in were from Germany and France. So you had Dutch, German, French, and also Khoi and Sandpeople, and, all the imported slaves that I mentioned. And they started to mesh together into a language that was sort of a mix of all of these different linguistic backgrounds. And what developed in this period was the beginnings of what would eventually become the language Afrikaans, which is a language that is pretty unique to South Africa. And the colony was pretty successful, and they started to expand northwards into more and more of indigenous territory, which led to conflicts with not only the Khoi and the Sandpeople, but also new groups such as the Sandpeople. And that competition created fighting. Specifically, a really common raiding tactic that would show up a lot in South Africa, which is cattle raiding. All of the Dutch stuff started in the 1650s, but the expansion north and the friction started in the late 1700s. It would continue on until about, I think they're still working on that. So during the Napoleonic era, South Africa, as part of the Netherlands, which had been conquered by France at a certain point, became sort of aligned with Napoleon. So in order to prevent South Africa from falling into French hands, the British invaded in 1795. Then after the French were defeated and the Napoleonic era was over, the Brits decided to take it as a spoil of war. So in the treaty, they decided that, we're just going to keep South Africa, sorry. They renamed it to the Cape Colony. They had actually not that much interest in it beyond just being a strategic port, again, on the route to India, which Britain was starting to get pretty interested in. Then once you get to the mid-1800s, things start to really ramp up and get much more contentious. So in the early 19th century, the English brought two major reforms to Cape Colony that the Dutch people living there didn't much appreciate, specifically forcing them to speak English, and second, banning slavery, which the Dutch living there, otherwise known as the Boers, really did not appreciate. So Boers, which is the word for the Afrikaans-speaking, sort of more Dutch white South Afrikaners, which is going to be important in the future, don't worry, started to leave the Cape Colony and move more into the interior of what would be called, northern South Africa. Northern South Africa. This started to escalate, and then in the 1830s, there was a big trek of a lot of Boers moving into the region. Like 30 to 50 wild Boers. They were mad that they couldn't practice slavery. What can I say but yikes? So they expanded into the region and made 3 independent states known as the South African Republic, the Orange Free State, and Natalia. And of course, they were not expanding into empty territory, despite what the far-right myths about this time will tell you. They were expanding into indigenous territory that was owned by herders and, those people who had been living there for 130,000 years. The Brits did not like this idea of there being independent African kingdoms, but also independent Dutch states. So Brits came for them. Just put a pin in that for now. I want to talk about some cool shit going on in the meantime. One part of the Nguni tribe, known as the Zulu, started to really take off in the early 19th century, with Shaka Zulu, the leader, leading this huge campaign to conquer tons and tons of territory, founding a kingdom to take over all of the chieftains. Shaka Zulu was so successful because he modernized the military structure and had his own people in charge instead of local chieftains. And, well, Shaka Zulu today is considered this legendary Zulu warrior of South African history. And probably is going to be his own video someday because his story is quite epic and one that we need to learn more about. The displacement of people caused by this campaign of expansion from the Zulus led to the formation of what would become the modern nation states of Lesotho and Eswatini. So in the late 19th century, the Cape Colony was getting little bits of independence, a little bit more autonomy, but for the most part, it was still very much in the British Empire. And within Cape Colony, they started to develop, electoral systems, including suffrage not based on race. Would have been great if that stayed. And of course, that was not the case in the Boer republics. We'll get there. Also, because of a labor shortage, especially in the region of Natal, lots and lots of Indian workers were brought to South Africa to work. This led to Natal, this region of South Africa, becoming one of the largest communities of Indian people outside of India, including Mahatma Gandhi, who lived a good chunk of his life in South Africa and was a civil rights leader there. Another interesting thing was there was another one of these big treks out to find a place to settle by the Griqua people, which is this sort of movement brought about by a bunch of mixed race people. They eventually settled, and then the British started to sort of encroach on them, so they decided to move, and then the British encroached on them, and eventually they were conquered. But just cool little story that there was this trek of mixed race people united by their mixed race identity and going and settling places. What I'm learning is that in South Africa, mixed race is an identity in and of itself and has a lot of unique things to it. And so their story is quite interesting. And I'm doing a brief history, not an incredibly detailed history, so they get incredibly skimmed over. But please, If you find any of this interesting, please look it up yourself, or if you think something is really worth a video, just yell at me in the comments. It's fine, it's fine, fine. Everyone does it. The British also did a very settler colonial thing, started making these extremely unfair deals with indigenous people, the indigenous black population, thinking that, oh, so you're asking to use part of our territory for a period of time and, you know, still under us in exchange for these things. And, you know, the Europeans thinking, no, you just gave us this land for, you know, these pittance that we gave you. It's very reminiscent of how people treated indigenous people here in the Americas. So not only were the British doing this, but the Boers were pretty much always in a low-grade state of conflict on their frontiers against indigenous people who, you know, wanted to continue living on the land that is theirs. During this period, the British annexed the Zulu kingdom in a series of extremely bloody wars. The British also annexed the Basotho people, and the Boer states were conquering territory owned by the Ndebele and the Bapele people. And then diamonds. In the late 1860s, diamonds were discovered in South Africa. Just so happens it was right underneath where those Griqua people were living. So the British conquered the Griquas to basically take their land to build diamond mines. By the late 19th century, South Africa was producing 95% of the world's diamonds. This vast amount of wealth tripled the amount of money that South Africa was making off of exports, and it gave them the economic boost that they needed to, like Canada and Australia, start towards the path of becoming a dominion, which is sort of a part way toward becoming independent. It's like independence asterisk, because you still don't have control over your own foreign policy or military, but you get to do everything else yourself. And of course, the diamond mines succeeded because of the ruthless exploitation of black labor that was not paid very well at all. Interesting when you're an indigenous people of a place and you find out that it's obscenely wealthy with some of the rarest materials and most in-demand materials on Earth, and then, you know, you don't get to experience any of the wealth that comes from that. Good thing those days are over. It's not. Those days aren't over. So not long after diamonds were discovered, in the Transvaal region, gold was discovered. And this was even more brutal and even more dangerous work because gold in South Africa required these extremely deep mines. And in the 19th century, you can imagine, not super, super safe. It was so unsafe that the African laborers living in the region refused to work in those mines. They were just too dangerous. And so the mine owners had to rely on imported labor from China. South Africa. What a fun story. All of this mineral wealth and, you know, long-term expansion plans led to a series of wars for the British to take out these independent Boer republics. These are collectively called the Boer Wars. They happened in the late 19th and early 20th century. And in the first war, the British got their asses handed to them. But in the second war, they imported so many troops from across the empire that they outnumbered the Boers by a ridiculous margin, and the Boers were defeated. I know about this because in Canada, we talk about how Canadian troops were sent in the Second Boer War. And yeah, we helped the British conquer these Boer republics. And when I used to live in London, Ontario, there's a lot of references to Canadian involvement with the Boer Wars, a completely unnecessary war to nakedly steal resources from people who are then nakedly stealing resources from indigenous people. So there's like two layers of colonization going on here. Canada, you know, we sell ourselves as having this wonderful history, and we are just collaborators in the worst things all the time. I should also mention that the Boer Wars were the first use by the British of several wonderful tactics that would become very endemic of 20th century combat, specifically the scorched earth policy, which is when you are retreating from a region, you destroy anything that might be of use to your enemies so that they can't get anything and they start suffering attrition when they start entering that territory. And concentration camps, which, you know, another thing we're still doing today. So once the Boer Wars were over and all of the Boer republics were unified under British rule, the British smashed them all together with Cape Colony and made the Union of South Africa. In 1909, it was made into a legit independent dominion. Because of that, South Africa was involved in the First World War, fighting Germany and East Africa. By the way, one of the history YouTubers who is participating in this Project Africa series is doing a video on World War I in East Africa. You should go and watch that next. But yeah, there were South African troops in East Africa, West Africa, the Middle East, and even in Europe in the trenches with everyone else. The South Africans also participated in World War II. One thing to note is that amongst the Afrikaners, who are, you know, now the new word for the people who are of Afrikaans speaking, because there's no more Boer republics, there was a surprisingly high amount of Afrikaner participation in pro-Nazi groups, which after the war were folded into the Afrikaner-focused National Party, and we'll get to the National Party in just a minute. The first leader of South Africa was Louis Botha, who was part of the South African Party, but from the get-go there were tensions between the English and the Afrikaners. The black population of South Africa were also, you know, angry and wanted to increase their lot in life and did not like being colonized by white people. So a group of black resistance movements got together to form the South African Native National Conference, which will become a big player in the resistance against black oppression in South Africa. Just you wait. And it was actually quite a unique group too, because they were made up of a mix of traditional and pretty modern groups. There were, you know, Western educated people in this movement, as well as, you know, just indigenous chiefs. In 1924, that national party that I mentioned that was run by the Afrikaners came to power. And what this resulted in is Afrikaans, which was considered sort of a low language by the working class, you know, like a mixed language. It replaced Dutch as one of the two official languages of South Africa. And so the Union of South Africa continued until about 1960, when a referendum was passed that made South Africa leave the British Commonwealth and become an independent republic. Hey everyone, I just want to take a quick break from the story to talk a little bit about this video sponsor, Dashlane. So the world has a problem as we get more interconnected and more internety, which is that we unfortunately live in a society. I'm sure you've heard people talk about how you need a really strong, really not rememberable password that's different for every single site, that if you're on a public Wi-Fi network, to prevent you from being hacked, you need to have a VPN, and to prevent all your stuff from getting hacked, you need to be constantly checking to see who's been hacked, whose passwords have been leaked, so you can change things and make sure that, you know, you don't get all of your shit stolen. Now, there are services that cover VPNs and password managers and all these things to make sure that, you know, you don't get your shit ruined. But Dashlane takes all of them, plus dark web monitoring, to make sure that your passwords are safe, that your payment information is safe, and that, you know, it's all done easy and without much thinking. So you can quickly log into things without having to put in your information over and over and over again, that you can pay for things without having to put in information over and over again, and that anytime a hack happens, they know that you need to change your password, and they'll change it to something super, super hard to hack, and you could just lock it down. As some of you might know, I have attention deficit hyperactive disorder, and I have been on the internet since I'm like almost 31, since the late 90s, and that's being generous. So I have a lot of random sites that I've made accounts on that I've completely forgotten about that might get hacked someday. So that means that I've used password managers for years in order to keep on top of things. Of course, I never want to miss the next hot episode of Nobbleberry, so VPNs are also useful for getting around region blocks and things like that. And one service which actually can be free. And if you're a lazy asshole like me, when you want to buy something, you're tired of putting in your credit card information over and over again, Dashlane takes care of that too. So if you go to the link in the description or the one that's on the screen, you sign up. You don't even have to put in your credit card information. You can try it for free for as long as you want. But if you decide to go with the premium service, you can get 30 free days on your boy. And of course, by trying it out, no matter how you try it out, you are helping Step Back History. You're helping me keep these cats who keep interrupting my takes fed, and you keep the apartment that I paid way too much in rent in paid. So thank you, Dashlane, for making Step Back a possibility. And I now want to say I'm sorry to Dashlane, because now we're gonna go talk about apartheid. So when South Africa got its independence, some of the first things that it did was to clamp down on the human and civil rights of the people of color living in their country. Black people were not allowed to vote, and as a majority of the population of the country, about 70% of the country, were forced into these harsh segregated zones that made up about 8% of the country's landmass. So just imagine 70% of the country forced, evicted from their homes and forced to live in 8% of the country, these militarized slums, really. A small percentage, a tiny minority of white people owned 90% of the land in South Africa. In 1948, the National Party put a more codified and harsh set of laws in place that were very similar to these and gave it the official name of apartheid, which is the Afrikaans word for apartness. And it wasn't too long until the world really was against it. In 1966, the United Nations officially embargoed South Africa, calling apartheid a crime against humanity. When they refused to end apartheid in 1974, South Africa was kicked out of the United Nations and wouldn't rejoin until 1994. But while diplomatically isolated, who could possibly be an ally of a country which takes its indigenous population and forces them into these open-air militarized prisons in order to maintain white supremacy? I mean, of course, South Africa's close ally was Israel. These two white supremacist states primarily traded weapons to fund this massive police military force that South Africa required in order to keep its indigenous people under control. And the United States got in on the game by shipping weapons to South Africa via Israel. There's even a pretty substantiated rumor that Israel tested its open secret nuclear weapons program in South Africa on an island off the coast. Then in South Africa, things got even worse in 1970 with the Homelands Act, where they took a lot more people, evicted them from their homes, and put them in these reserves called Bantustans. In the 1980s, and this came out through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there were these death squads and police detachments that did state-sanctioned assassination of dissidents against the state for people fighting for black rights and opposing apartheid. They would kill people and then they would falsely call it black-on-black crime. Isn't that fun? And this went on for years. To maintain white supremacy, South Africa had to expend a lot of resources, to the point where they were spending over a quarter of their annual budget on the military. So, like, what do you do? What do black people do in such horribly oppressive conditions? Well, I will tell you, they didn't take it lying down. Do you remember the South African Native National Congress? Well, in the 40s and 50s, the student part of that movement started to formulate into the African National Congress. They were inspired by Gandhi and the movement to liberate India and wanted to do the same in South Africa. They did a campaign of defiance against the state, which was mostly things like boycotts, strikes, civil disobedience, you know, non-violent tactics to try and change things over. In 1955, the ANC became allies with a bunch of other groups representing people of mixed race, of Indian background, of various different backgrounds, and they made a sort of coalition of organizations in order to fight apartheid. In that meeting, they made a document that called for racial equality in South Africa and dedicated themselves to the cause of fighting it with every tooth and nail they could. The ANC also tried to talk to universities and get them to do an academic boycott of South Africa. But then when the ANC tried to resist non-violently a law that would require black South Africans to use identification cards when going into white areas, the government murdered tons of these activists in something called the Sharpeville Massacre. After that, the ANC decided that non-violence was no longer on the table. They started a military wing and started to resist the South African government using, like, sabotage and targeted attacks on the colonial infrastructure, and it was led by Nelson Mandela. In 1962, Nelson Mandela was arrested by the South African government, tried as a terrorist, and sentenced to life in prison. The military campaigns of the ANC continued throughout the 70s and 80s under different leadership. They got backing from the Soviet Union to oppose apartheid, which then led to the United States and many Western powers supporting apartheid in order to oppose communism. Thank you, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, for that one. And South Africa started to raid and bomb ANC bases in neighboring countries. Things didn't get better until the USSR collapsed, and a lot of public support for the ANC in the West started to pick up, and South Africa basically buckled under pressure. In 1990, the ANC was no longer a banned group, and peace talks began, beginning with the release of Nelson Mandela from prison. The early 90s were a very optimistic time for South Africa. In 1991, apartheid ended. In 1993, South Africa got a new constitution which guaranteed equal rights for everyone to vote. In 1994, South Africa had its first multiracial election, where the ANC was elected by a huge majority, and Nelson Mandela became the first democratically elected president of South Africa. And you know, a lot of tellings of the history of South Africa would, say, well, that's good, and then kind of ride off into the sunset from there. But that would be telling an overly happy story. Since the end of apartheid, about 800,000 white skilled workers left the country, representing about a quarter of the white population of South Africa. The government ended up having a lot of financial issues from foreign development loans and also a massive program to combat HIV in South Africa, where it was a huge, huge issue. Those gold mines still abuse migrant labor, and South Africa today is one of the most unequal countries on earth. The ANC, which had a lot of socialist principles behind its founding, in the 90s turned towards neoliberal economics, including regressive tax cuts and things like that. And various geopolitical events happening in their neighboring countries have created a lot of refugees and migrants whom South Africans have been extremely xenophobic against, leading to some brutal mistreatment. There was one study I found that said that South African xenophobia is some of the strongest on the planet. And of course, I'm sure you've heard from white nationalist, great replacement, white genocide, internet trash goblins like those people have been promoting a conspiracy theory that the blacks are killing all of the whites and that there's a white genocide happening in South Africa. It's completely unfounded, totally untrue. And I'm not going to get into it because there's a lot to get into, but I'm going to link to 2 videos by Rational Disconnect and Jose that talk about it pretty well. As a white settler in a settler colonial state, the story of South Africa certainly rhymes a lot with my country's story, with America's story, with Israel's story, with Australia's story, and so on. South Africa's had a very harsh history, and despite that, a few moments of victory, of justice. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission, to come to terms with just how bad apartheid was one of the greatest moments of healing between settlers and the colonized. And Canada, when we did a similar thing, based it off of the South African example. It's actually why we know so many dark details about apartheid after the end of it. What else can I say except they've been through a lot, and I hope they get the good times that they deserve. Hey everyone, before you go, this video was part of a massive collaboration called Project Africa with 26 history creators making videos on the continent. You can definitely go and find the playlist. If you want to check out the next video down the list, you go to the video by History Hustle about Germany and East Africa in World War I. Of course, if you like this video and you want to tell the story of South Africa, please share it with social media, with friends, with communities, subreddits of your choice. And lastly, I'd love to shout out all of my wonderful patrons. If you want to help make videos like this possible, and you have the dosh to do so, please go to patreon.com/stepbackhistory and give as little as $1 a month. They got to see this video early and they didn't have the ad break, so, there's that to enjoy. Thank you all very much, and I'll see you guys next time for more Step Back.